or for questions. Let's get our panelists up here, please. If you come on up, they're listed in the program. We have a tireless advocate, 2 lawyers, and a scientist. And there's probably a joke in there somewhere, but I haven't worked it out yet. So the tireless advocate, the 2 lawyers, and the advocate, they all go to a bar. No, I don't know. I don't know what happens. So it's great to have you all with us. Their names are the program. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on introductions, but we have Rob Bilott, who is focused for many years on the subject of PFOAs. We talked about him a little bit earlier and his story and his suit. Ultimately, we can get an update on where he stands a year later. By the way, this is the same panel we did last year, which you could say was us being a little bit lazy, but actually this is great because we can really get a sense of how things have changed, if at all, in the past year. Have they changed a little bit, folks, would you say? Yeah, I think that's accurate to say. Mei Wu is with NRDC. She's an attorney, and she works on a lot of issues. I think we're going to talk a little bit about chlorpyrifos, which is a story I'm working on right now, which is another fascinating tale of dangerous chemicals in the environment and the reluctance to do anything about it. Linda Reinstein, who lost her husband to mesothelioma, and who is the tireless advocate to finally have some sort of federal action on asbestos, which when you tell people, by the way, the stuff that people get into moon suits to remediate, which we're all familiar with, has not been addressed at all in a regulatory fashion by the EPA, or was addressed but then reversed in 1991. When you tell people that, they're pretty shocked, and it turns out it's kind of a poster child for the slowness of the EPA, which well predates the current regime, but obviously we're now on 11 when it comes to that. And finally, Jessie Miler, who is at American University, who's going to talk to us about also some, what you would call common sense regulations that were being put into place to make it illegal for kids, we're talking about teenagers, to apply pesticides, which are not, these are restricted use pesticides, the kind of things that like a tablespoon will kill you kind of pesticides, restricting teenagers' ability to spray these things in the fields in the Central Valley of California. That, too, is being rolled back, which is pretty shocking on the face of it. There was a time when the environment was a bipartisan issue, right? I remember growing up when the Cuyahoga River was on fire, and a certain president, believe it or not, Richard Nixon, created the EPA. Who created the National Park System? Teddy Roosevelt. Republicans were frequently considered among environmentalists, and this whole notion that there's some sort of zero-sum game here, jobs versus the environment, which to me is a completely false choice, has been kind of baked into our political discourse. And now we're at a point where, throw a little bit of climate change, and happens to be that one of the leading climate change action advocates happened to be a presidential candidate in 2000. And subsequent to that, the political lines have just hardened on the environment, and we're in this nonsense debate that for some reason, if we pay attention to the environment, if we regulate dangerous chemicals, we're going to tank the economy. And there is no research or science that would suggest this is true, but that's part of the problem, is that in the process of all of this, science itself has been called into question and tainted, and we no longer accept scientific facts as facts. We're in a post-fact era. So there we are. That's the end of the panel. Thank you very much for coming. So we can just all sigh and go home. But no, we can. Yeah. I think we can. Let's talk. I'm just going to go down the line, and let's start with Jessie. Jessie, these restricted use pesticides. And I think a recurring theme that you're going to hear from everybody here is that there was kind of a rising crescendo of action at the EPA. And we're probably going to focus mostly on the EPA here, but that's kind of a poster child for the larger federal government here. But there was kind of a rising crescendo of regulatory activity in the EPA at the tail end of the Obama administration. And, to be honest, the EPA has, the fact that asbestos had not been dealt with is just one of the many chemicals on the so-called TSCA list, the Toxic Substances Control Act. These are like the hit list of chemicals that the EPA has not addressed, and asbestos was right at the top, and it hadn't been dealt with for quite some time. And yet, there was movement on the TSCA front thanks to some legislation. Now all the brakes are on, and we're going into reverse as quickly as we can. So, Jessie, let's first of all just talk about what the idea was, the simple idea on some of these restricted use pesticides, and where that particular thing stands. And as we go through here, I think through each of your particular chemicals and fights, I think we'll get some insight as to where we stand right now in the federal level. So you go ahead.
Sure. So, like Miles mentioned, there are 2 rules that Obama put forward to protect people that are under 18 and using restricted use pesticides. And those 2 rules are currently being held up.
And these are pesticides, just to clarify, these are pesticides none of us see. These are really bad actors. Go ahead.
And they're known to be very toxic, like Miles said. It's a very little amount is actually very toxic. And so they are considered to be restricted use. They are only used by commercial entities. And so these would be people that are hired to work on farms for commercial, industrial level agriculture. And some of the 2 rules that were put forward by Obama would protect people under 18 from exposure to these restricted use pesticides. And these 2 rules are actually being held up now in that they were being phased in by Obama. And so over time, they were supposed to be phased in. They were in the process of actually being implemented, and now they're being held up, and so they're not actually likely to go into full effect. And so what that will result in is people under 18 being exposed to these very toxic pesticides. One of the rules actually will allow people under 18, so children, to apply for the use to actually apply these pesticides. And so they would be the actual applicators using these pesticides. So that's one part of what
So what could go wrong with that?
Right.
A 14-year-old with a teaspoon of which can kill you. So, and stating the obvious here, taking aside the child labor laws issues, which I suppose in the migratory, migrant worker environment is kind of lax, to say the least?
Well, I will say, May and I were talking about this a little bit beforehand, and it's not just that. It's also people that are working on farms, of industrial scale farms, and they are training their kids or other people in how to use these pesticides. And so it's not just people that are moving in and using it, but they're actually people that are that are living and working on the farms as well that are going to be exposed to it.
So it's kind of Dickensian, we have these kids out there in the fields being forced to do this. And is this a simple bottom line thing? That it's cheaper to put a 14-year-old out there, and the agricultural interests are pushing for this, or what's behind this one?
I'm not going to necessarily speak to the economics of it.
All right, fair enough.
I'm a toxicologist, but I'll let somebody else answer that part.
You don't want to go there. All right. Okay, so Linda, let's talk about asbestos. When you tell your story, because I've been working on a story with her. It's like the only one I got to do a story with Rob here. Anyway, these are my sources for various stories now. But in doing the story I'm doing with Linda right now, and I mentioned to people asbestos has not been dealt with, they're shocked. Do you get that a lot?
I would say 9 out of 10 Americans think asbestos was banned. They don't understand the inherent risk, can't identify asbestos in their homes, schools, and workplaces, and the propaganda from American Chemistry Council, etc., that really blurs the line. And then you throw in the EPA right now, and we have a perfect storm.
So latter days of Obama administration, when we first met you and they were doing the hearings on the TSCA chemicals, and asbestos is right there at the top of the Toxic Substances Control Act chemicals, the hit list, if you will. It seemed like progress was being made somewhat. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah, initially I'd say that's accurate, but like NRDC and many others and ADO fought hard to have asbestos recognized as a priority chemical. Believe it or not, there are people within the industry that claim they have safe use and lobbied against asbestos being named a top 10. So although we accomplished that in December, we have now been facing slow walking and irreversible rollbacks.
I'm curious about the safe use case for asbestos, because my understanding, a lot of these, what we're going to be talking about here, connecting dots between exposures and cancer is always difficult. But this one is actually a pretty ironclad case, isn't it?
Well, to us as scientists and academics, yes, it is. But to the industry, it's really easy to kind of shift things around. They produce an infographic. They conveniently leave mining off and disposal. And they make it look so great and perfect in this chamber that's airtight. And they literally have people believe that they have safe use. However, World Health Organization, ILO, Surgeon General, old EPA would all agree that there is no safe or controlled use of asbestos.
So what specifically is happening now at the Pruitt EPA as it relates to asbestos? Have they made specific moves to walk things back, or are you just waiting for a shoe to drop?
No, they've actually released a document with NRDC and many others. There's our EPA is being sued, unfortunately, by NGOs. So what happened as a result of the latest evaluation document is the EPA deemed that they would not look at legacy use of asbestos and other chemicals. In other words, the 35 million homes that are contaminated with attic insulation that has asbestos, our heavy consumption is just off the table for evaluation, and they took another fiber off. So basically, the EPA is removing risk, which is not part of the statute, and I don't think it would have happened under another administration. So we collectively are fighting hard to get TSCA to work and be properly implemented, and at the same time, we're having to fight the wealthiest people on K Street that work for American Chemistry Council to have the true science told and hold Mr. Pruitt accountable.
So after all these years and all the stories about asbestos and all the moonsuit remediations, there's still a debate about safe use, and there's still a strong lobbying constituency to push away from further regulation. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah, as a mesothelioma widow, it makes me angry that this still goes on. So I'll do my research, and I can uncover letter after letter from the Chemistry Council saying that it's safe. They have a great revolving door at ACC where you have Cal Dooley and David Vitter. So you have members of Congress actually working within ACC. So we're fighting hard, and unfortunately, we have many members of ACC that now work at the EPA.
Right at the top.
Many.
Yeah, right at the top. Okay, so May, let's. There's a lot of things that
Makes me
NRDC gets into, but I mean, apropos the theme of this conversation, why don't we talk a little bit about chlorpyrifos, which is yet another chemical which used to be available in a consumer setting, and some really interesting science done at Columbia and on the West Coast in California as well. Found this very, very specific cancer clusters related to exposure to, I guess, what is essentially RAID or was RAID in a certain time frame, and developmental disabilities among young children, mostly in socioeconomically disadvantaged people. So this was one that the good EPA science, which took decades, literally. The EPA, even on its best days, was a slow-moving operation. But had finally come to the point where, of course, years ago, what happened was when this science came out, is it Dow or DuPont? It's Dow, right? Dow. Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, Dow. Voluntarily pulled chlorpyrifos off of consumer shelves in exchange, although not officially, but wink nod, was able to continue using it in agricultural settings. So it's used like crazy on oranges and almonds and you name it in the Central Valley. And anybody who lives near these fields, which is to say the migrant workers, there's huge clusters of young people with developmental disabilities. And so the idea was to ban it completely. And the EPA had recommended that after all these years, and now where are we?
Yeah, they're not.
Okay, thank you very much, May.
That's it. No big surprise. So when it was just towards the end of the Obama administration, when the EPA basically, showed all the science explaining why this pesticide ought to be banned. And then we had an election, and now the Pruitt administration, Scott Pruitt, came out and said, I think we need to look at a little more science, the 20 whatever years that NRDC has been working on chlorpyrifos, and I know EPA has been looking at it this long. He's like, I think it's still a little uncertain. Maybe we need to just look at it some more, and they're not taking action to ban this known dangerous neurotoxin that, is on the fruits and vegetables that children eat the most, grapes and apples and bananas and oranges and things like that. And it's shown to like decreases in IQ and in attention deficit disorder and all these things. And yet, the Pruitt administration says, well, we're not really sure about it, so let's just not do anything now.
So they're suggesting let's do some more research, and meanwhile, the scientific advisory committees at the EPA, which are the source of all this research, have been upended.
That's right.
Almost every academic scientist I'm aware of has been fired or is about to get fired. Right. And they have been replaced with mostly researchers with corporate links. How worried are you about that trend?
Very worried. I guess when it comes to kind of all the pesticide regulation in general, EPA, before pesticides are put to market because they are known to be toxic. They're designed to be poisons. And so there's supposed to be this research that goes into and looking at all the data for the impacts of this pesticide. And so, the industry does submit those data to EPA before their pesticides can be approved for the market. But there's also that check in there where EPA is supposed to independently review that data and determine whether or not it shows if there are adverse effects. And so if you have advisory panels that advise EPA, and if you have scientists at EPA, who knows, or you have political decision makers who are driven by their industry ties, they're going to make decisions that could actually run counter to what the scientists are saying. And, in other contexts, we've already heard this happening where there are career folks at EPA who are still there and still trying to do the right thing and very much, want to uphold their mission to protect the environment. And they will tell us that they're making certain decisions, A, B, and C, which are reasonable and are protective. And then suddenly we find out that EPA announces that they're doing X, Y, and Z because the decision has now been taken out of the career folks' hands, and now it's the political decision makers who have completely gone against science and just said, well, whatever, we're going to go and side with the industry on this one.
Correct me if I'm wrong, in the European Union, the burden of proof on chemicals is shifted the other direction. You have to prove it's safe before you release it. We, in this country, assume a chemical is great, we release it, and then if we see trouble, then people like Rob get involved, or you too. Is that accurate, and does that work in the EU?
Well, so as far as I understand it, and I'm definitely not an expert in it, but in the European Union, it's more of a precautionary principle, which is, if there is concern that it might have harm, then you should err on the side of protecting people as opposed to helping the chemical. And here, it really is innocent until proven guilty, which is great in a criminal sense, not so useful when it comes to toxic chemicals. But it is, very much the burden of proof is on those who have been harmed to show that that harm has happened.
Rob, if PFOAs were subject to that kind of burden of proof, that level of scrutiny when they were first introduced, would they have ever been introduced?
Probably not. Probably not. The situation I was involved in, we're talking today, we're hearing a lot about things that people kind of already know, recognize. These are carcinogens. These are things we shouldn't be exposed to. Here's how we can avoid, prevent ourselves from being exposed. The situation I was dealing with was something where the people didn't even know they were being exposed. And, we're back several steps in that process. Trying to make sure that, first of all, do you even know what you're being exposed to? And then what will it do to you? And, what steps can we take to actually, if we think it's a carcinogen or a cancer risk, how do we protect ourselves? And this was a sort of a poster child for the situation you were just describing with the problem with the way these chemicals came out onto the market. It was before there was an EPA, before there was any regulatory process for determining are they safe, are they not safe. These chemicals that I've been dealing with, perfluorochemicals, and there are hundreds or thousands of them. We just happen to be dealing with one that we found out about. But there were hundreds and thousands of them. They predated the EPA. They're out on the market, and people had been exposed for decades and decades. Then we found out there was an exposure. And unfortunately, the regulatory agencies knew nothing about these. And none of the information had been provided to the regulatory agencies. And it was up to the citizens, the people who were drinking it, who were seeing there were cancer studies that had been done internally by the companies, confirming they were confirmed animal carcinogens. They were seeing increased cancer rates in humans. But they still were not informing the regulatory agencies or the population that was being exposed. When we found out about it, the burden was on the people being exposed to have to prove these were harmful. And in the situation we dealt with, we had to actually develop a process for doing that, because we alert the US EPA in 2001. We alert all the federal and state agencies about this. And that process is incredibly slow, as I'm sure many of you in the room have dealt with, know that process. And in fact, as we sit here today, these chemicals still are not regulated by the US EPA. We had to approach it through a process where the citizens took that on themselves to prove that these things caused cancer, to prove they were harmful. They proved that in our water, if we drink this will increase our cancer risk. That was done by the citizens themselves. Even then, you turn that information over to the US EPA and the federal agencies and say, see, it does in fact increase risk of human cancers. People should be advised not to drink it, not to be exposed. Still isn't enough to get the US EPA to move and to advise people. And now these chemicals are showing up in drinking water, not just in isolated areas, but all over the United States and now worldwide. And what we're seeing is the action that's being taken that recognizes these are cancer risks, these are a threat. It's coming from international sources, from in Europe and elsewhere, where they do take a more precautionary approach. They apply the precautionary principle. If there is a risk, we're going to stop the exposures at a minimum and not allow people to be essentially human guinea pigs, just to see, well, okay, this may cause cancer. Let's wait 30 years. Let's let everybody get exposed for 20 or 30 years. Once they develop the cancers, okay, now we'll say it's a carcinogen. It's too late. So at least we're seeing that starting, at least in the European side, that these things are being recognized as risks that ought to be stopped. And really the push is now on to try to get that concept recognized here in the United States. This is an entire class of chemicals that present risk. The exposure should stop, and there needs to be education. But we saw, for example, in the community we were dealing with, this stuff was in the water. Thousands of people are drinking it. They're carcinogens. None of the local doctors at the cancer treatment centers who were treating these people had any clue that any of their patients were exposed to it. So how do you prevent something if you don't first know you're exposed, and then at least be able to make the choice? If you're picking up a cigarette, you know you're picking up the cigarette, or you're eating the hamburger. But this is tap water. You're flipping on the tap. And you don't, you're assuming, but nowadays we're told drink lots of water. Most people would assume I'm doing something okay by picking up my tap and opening the tap and drinking my water. But these are things people don't even know they've been exposed to. So, the thing I've been working on is trying to get education and awareness that these exposures exist, they present risks, people need to be educated about them, informed they're being exposed, and the exposure should stop.
Really interesting parallels to the asbestos story here, too, isn't it? What's interesting to me is the political narrative now is the EPA is an aggressive, overreaching, in-your-shorts agency that is changing, making it impossible for people to sell chemicals, do business, clear off mountaintops, burn coal, whatever the case may be. The EPA I saw prior to this administration was really slow, bureaucratic, and ineffectual. What would you say?
Yes. Yes. I mean,
So how did this narrative begin? That somehow the EPA is ruining the country by trying to clean things up, when in fact they weren't doing a very good job.
No, I mean, the situation I was dealing with, it started in 1998, and a lot of the science and a lot of the information that was coming out was during the prior administration. And this is a systemic issue. It's the way the regulatory system is set up, in the way chemicals are regulated, and where the burdens of proof are, and what's required before a regulatory agency can move forward. And what kind of burdens are required to prove, for example, with asbestos, for people to accept this is dangerous and we're going to stop or prohibit the exposures. And I think what you see here is with asbestos, with perfluorochemicals, you're almost at impossible burdens of proof. You've got massive human health studies confirming these effects, and if that's not good enough, what is?
So, Jessie, it's been a year. Probably seems like a little longer for you at this point, given lots has happened. I'm curious, first of all, when you're trying to state your case in the context at the EPA, for example, is it a waste of time, a waste of breath right now? And are you looking at different ways to approach things like these restricted use chemicals or some of the other chemicals that you're tracking? Is it important to be thinking about other regulatory levels, whether it's state or local, that kind of thing, as an alternative in this time where clearly the EPA is not in the mood to be putting any sort of regulation in the books? Well,
I'll speak to that twofold. One, at the federal level, I mean, the EPA, while, yes, was ineffectual and definitely in ways, with perfluorinated chemicals and with asbestos, there is information and resources that they do make available that are really important, like the Integrated Risk Information System, like IRIS. It's a really valuable tool that puts together all sorts of industrial chemical information that we can use for scientific evidence to make risk assessments. So you have dose response information. We know how much exposure will cause harm. And so you can actually look at the different kinds of harm or damage that it might cause, including cancer.
Yeah, but isn't IRIS itself under great attack right now?
So that's why I was going to mention that. Yes.
Please, excuse me.
So that's something that is valuable that we need to try to retain, and it is being targeted as something that industry does not want to have available. And so it is completely unbiased, objective. It is scientific evidence that's provided and that scientists use then to make risk assessments. And so that's something that is available at the federal level that we don't want to see lost, right? That is then also used by state and local decision makers in making risk assessment decisions. And so, and you mentioned, we were talking about California and New York and being a little bit more at the forefront of, as far as like chemical regulations go. And so those chemicals that are identified as being toxic, carcinogenic, neurotoxic, whatever it is, they're at the state level using this information to make those decisions. And so it's really important to hold on to IRIS, the IRIS system and other.
But that's a big if. In the absence of an IRIS, I mean, we did a story not too long ago on the hexavalent chromium in Hinckley, and as part of the IRIS process on that, of course, the EPA, all these advisory boards are kind of subbed out at the EPA, and there were multiple members on the advisory board, and this is the Erin Brockovich chemical, which, by the way, is still not addressed among, a lot of people thought, she won the suit and everybody lived happily ever after, and in Hinckley it's the same problem. But what we found...
And many other places, too.
Yeah, and what we found was multiple members on these scientific advisory boards who actually had active financial relationships with Pacific Gas and Electric, who was the polluter in Hinckley. And they're like, oh, well, we don't have a conflict of interest. We just pretend we don't think about that, and which is, of course, on the face of it. So if IRIS itself it becomes a problem, California is a very prosperous, the fifth largest economy in the world. They can probably do their own science if they want, but, I mean, are we missing some real science if that gets taken away?
We would definitely be missing some real science. Yeah, it's a critical part, and it's something that EPA has compiled and upkeeps and makes available to everyone. And so anyone can go on and look up chemical and industrial use chemicals and see, the different risks associated with them.
So that's got to be a little bit troubling, even when you're thinking about using California as a vehicle to change regulation if they don't have access to that kind of data. Linda, when it comes to asbestos now, you don't see, you're still, every time I talk to you, you're on a plane to Washington. You have not given up coming here. Is this like, Animal House, thank you, sir, I'll have another? You just keep coming back again and again.
No, not exactly. It does feel like Groundhog Day sometimes, though. We work with 3 key points. We work on education because we can't trust one agency to make sure our air, water, and soil is clean. We continue to work with lawmakers. We have a new bill that was introduced by Senator Merkley and will be introduced in the House, and NRDC and Less Cancer are endorsees to finally ban asbestos and stop the imports. And then our organization, along with many others like NRDC, we hold the EPA, the CPSC, and FDA accountable. We go into dockets, we do research. If they violate a statute, not my space, but clearly EDF and NRDC, they will sue those agencies in hopes that they do their job. So we work on 3 levels. So it is glacially slow and frustrating. But if you ever watch someone who's exposed to a chemical and actually get sick or worse yet die, you'll recognize that we can't stop. That as NGOs and others, we have to come to the table as stakeholders to make change happen. Or for you, we lost our fight, and it's our responsibility to clean it up. And I hope the millennials stay behind all of us to help.
I'm banking on them to clean up our mess, so it's all on you guys, because we really screwed it up. I'm sorry. May NRDC, you guys have a reasonable fundraising base. I know you do pretty well over there, but you still have to triage kind of which cases you go after. Are you kind of faced with a dilemma? There's only so many fights I can do, and how do you decide what to go after, what suits to file?
Yeah, it is. So I work in just the health part. We just reorganized, so our new name is Healthy People, Thriving Communities program. But we're sorry.
You better get that one down.
I literally, past week, we know the name. But so we're part of the health and food group, and within our group, we're about half scientists, half lawyers and policy people, and a lot of the ways, because it is just a huge slog of different chemicals that are a problem. One of the ways that we do make our decision is to, have the scientists look at the different chemicals and look at what's the most toxic, but also what has the highest routes of exposure. So then you kind of figure out this one's bad, and kids are eating it all the time because it's on all this food. Whereas maybe you have something that's worse, but the exposure pathway maybe isn't that big. And so we definitely have to triage that way. And then there's also the thoughts about the different tactics that we have available to us. And so it's difficult right now here in DC to go the federal route, but there are state actions, like you mentioned, that we could do. We do market campaigns. Maybe there are brands that can be compelled to say remove different chemicals from their products, or we can get the customers to urge them to change their practices or change their supplies, things like that. And so if we also identify that maybe here's a brand that cares a lot about its brand because moms trust them a lot, then we can go to them and say, hey, look, here's the chemical that you're using that causes a lot of problems in children. So do you want us to tell everybody, or do you want to go ahead and take it out of your product? So there are different ways to do it. And so that all kind of goes into our decision making.
So thinking about kind of an end around the political process and going straight to people is a good idea, and trying maybe an explanation that it is a false choice between jobs and health and safety and the environment. But is it hard to get that message out, you think? I think if you ask people, do you want a clean and safe environment, they would pretty much universally say yes, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. It really is about, people care about their families, and that's not a political issue. They wanna keep their families safe. And so, there is part of our job is to make that message resonate and be told in a way, because if you talk about cancer, slope factors, and potency, whatever, people don't get that. But if you say, this apple could cause your child to have this problem, then that does resonate with people, and I think then people feel more emboldened to take action or to call on their whatever state governments, on their governor, on their representative, on their local company to change and to take action.
So, Rob, like in the asbestos case, it was trial lawyers that really moved the needle on this. Is that a good way to do business? I mean, it's good for your business, obviously, but is that the way we should be doing regulation, running these things through the courts, class action lawsuits, that kind of thing, in the absence of a federal government that leans forward on this?
No, that's not efficient. If anything, it's incredibly inefficient. And one of the things we kind of learned the hard way was in the middle of that process, realizing we need to even step out of that system, the court system, and do it a different way, a non-litigating way, some way that's dominated by independent scientists making decisions that everybody agrees up front. We're going to be bound by these decisions. The companies, the citizens, everybody agrees, let's set up a scientific process to get the answers we need done. Because the critical thing that typically is missing here is funds. The funds, of course, are always the big issue. It's the funding to get the science done, get the big enough study done that can actually find statistically valid results and get enough people involved. So, you've really got to find a way to get not only, the citizens and the regulators involved, but the companies involved, because they typically are the ones that have the funding available to do these things. You don't want them controlling or dominating that science. But there are ways, I think, that you can do this in new alternative ways outside of litigation, outside of just pure litigation or regulation. And on the regulatory side, we're talking about state agencies. Yes, EPA can be slow. And there is some tremendous work being done by state agencies. There are some real leaders, even in perfluorochemicals, in the state agencies that are really among some of the people that know the most about these things. And so the last thing we really want is a system where simply having EPA looking at something stops the states from being able to move forward. And the Toxic Substances Control Act was amended, and one of the things I think people are a little worried about is there's new provisions in there that say if the EPA is looking at something, it could possibly stop the states. So you don't want, particularly if the EPA isn't getting the adequate funding or isn't really getting the staffing needed to do a thorough investigation, you don't want that being used as a method to stop very aggressive or very well-informed state agencies from doing what they're doing.
Certainly could have a chilling effect. Is there evidence that that's happened, or do we know?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So one of the things that the EPA did, well, actually, I think it might have come out of the House Science Committee, was this notion about human health studies and making it difficult for the EPA to conduct such studies. That's really important when you're talking about the kind of thing you're involved in. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely, because if you're in the litigation process, if you're going through the court system, the person who's exposed to these chemicals, they're the ones who have the burden to prove that this thing caused the harm. It's in this case, let's say, to prove it causes the cancer. So typically, if you're going to walk into a court, you're going to have to be able to point to peer-reviewed, published science that says this thing can cause your cancer. And so you have to get those studies. You have to get the science you need in order to be able to meet that burden of proof. And unfortunately, a lot of the times, the citizens or the people that are exposed don't have the funds to do that science. And the people that do maybe don't have the incentive to prove that link. So you have sort of a no-win situation when you walk into the court knowing you have to prove this, but the other side has the resources to do it. So that's why I was suggesting there's ways to do that, step out of that system and try to avoid that what oftentimes is a completely unworkable system.
So, Jessie, we've been talking a lot about the EPA and Scott Pruitt, but a lot of this isn't coming from the executive branch. It comes from Congress itself. I mean, when you think about what happened to the Stream Protection Act, that was a congressional action. That was to basically make it more difficult for strip mining to occur, primarily in West Virginia. That got upended by Congress. The Trump administration didn't have to do anything. And another one is these, I'm going to get the chemical names wrong, but it's TCE, MC, and MP. Now, these are bad actors. Tell us a little bit about them and what Congress, not EPA, not Pruitt, has tried to do on that front.
So these are three chemicals that are known to be toxic. TCE is used in dry cleaning. The other two are used in TCE is used in it's like spot cleaning and dry cleaning, and it's known to be a carcinogen and have other toxic effects as well. The other two are used in paint strippers, chemicals that are used for stripping paint, and they're known to be very toxic. There have been a number of fatal incidents with these chemicals also, so they're really
fairly recently
bad
too,
actors.
right?
Yeah. These chemicals were kind of on the fast track for review, needed to be, they were going to be regulated, and that has essentially been halted. And so
And this
there are
comes from
chemicals-
Congress. This
and
was
so
a congressional committee?
the
or?
chemicals that they go through, it usually takes a long time for these chemicals to go through these reviews and to actually then be regulated. And these were ones that were labeled during the Obama administration as being ones that should go through faster because they were really toxic. And so right now there's nothing being done on them right now. They've just kind of been halted. And so they're likely, there's nothing to say about what's going to happen with them right now because they haven't been acted on. The problem is that we know that they are very toxic, and what's going to happen is that we won't know what they're being used for or when we're being exposed to them because they're not actually being regulated for the exposures that we already know that we're experiencing because they're still in the paint strippers, they're still used in dry cleaning.
Right.
Yeah.
And these are members of Congress at the committee level who have made this decision to stop that? Or did the EPA get involved? Without getting too deep into that, but I'm just curious.
So the EPA is involved too, but
Yeah.
it's essentially at the congressional level.
Can I add one?
Yeah, please
Another
do.
example? So not specific to this, but there's also, just yesterday there was a hearing on the International Agency on Research on Cancer, and they had done some findings of glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup pesticide, which is one of the most popular pesticides ever. And they had found it, I think, as a likely or probable carcinogen, and Monsanto is up in arms about that. And so yesterday there was this huge hearing calling into question this international agency that did this finding. It's just a scientific body, independent, looked at all published studies on it. And now these members of Congress were trying to talk about, how can we unfund them and because they're not transparent or they're cherry picking data, all things which are not true. And yet they're trying to basically undermine the scientific underpinnings for decisions that regulatory agencies could make about carcinogens.
And that's at the, we're talking about this at the national level, the federal level, but this debate is going on at the international level. This is something that glyphosate is one of the most widely used pesticides in the world. And so this is talked about in WHO and
So as long as we're looking globally, Linda, let's talk about asbestos. There's really no asbestos mining in this country anymore. That's accurate to say, right?
Well, the fact that we stopped mining it in 2002, still 2002 in my state of California, that means you have Superfund sites, et cetera. So we may not be mining and manufacturing, but you still have a hangover effect from a toxic dumping left there.
And there's a big pile of it in New Hampshire just sitting up there at a mine, right?
And Pennsylvania, and there's about 16 active Superfund sites that need remediation.
And meanwhile, there is asbestos that gets into on consumer shelves by virtue of the fact that it is a global economy and we get a lot of things that are manufactured in China, for example. Tell us a little bit about that.
So because we don't have a ban, asbestos comes in consumer products. It could be in brakes that come from China. I don't want to give China a bad rap, but sorry,
We happen to import a lot from them.
We import a lot
yeah.
from China, and many times their talc mines are contaminated with asbestos. So we'll have talc, we'll have manufacturing, and if a box was marked like cigarettes are, if you go to a bar and you see skull and crossbones, if it was marked, consumers would be able to vote with their dollars. But because we are, I don't want to say misled, but it's really hard to determine whether or not you have a toxic product on your shelf unless you actually do your own testing. We as Americans, I think, fall prey to being innocent and believing our government has everything checked out for us, so we aren't actively engaged in consumer protection, which I would encourage people to turn products over, like the kids' makeup. That was tested to have tremolite in it.
Did you hear that? Kids' makeup with asbestos in it. Just take a few moments to ponder that one. That's on store shelves right now in this country.
It's been in crayons. We've tested that. It's been in...
What do kids do with crayons?
In
They
your
eat them.
mouth.
That's what I did, right?
But
Was that the wrong thing? Should I have not done that?
but what we
I
find,
ate Play-Doh, too. Was that bad? Anyway.
But what we find is the science is challenged. And I think it speaks to the fact that you had the IARC hearing, and we don't always have the same amount of funding as those like Monsanto, obviously. But we as Americans need to be actively engaged in consumer protection and public health in our environment. And if you notice something, I would encourage you to ask someone and question that, whether or not you have to product test or you have to turn a box over and maybe you're unsure. You have the opportunity to make very good consumer choices. If you don't know, then look at one of the NGOs that specialize in that chemical, or you can go to American University. But it's buyer beware.
I'm just trying to figure out from Bill how much longer we can go, because I've got plenty to talk about. How long do you want to go? What?
Andrea is the queen of the clock.
How much more time? Because I want to get some questions in. So if you have any questions, start thinking about those. What? All right, so raise your hand if you got questions. I'll come to you in a sec. No, I can do that. I'm doing Phil Donahue style. So remember him? You kids don't remember Phil Donahue, but back in the day, there was this guy. Yeah, hang on one second. I got some. I understand. Please sit down, Susie. I'll get to you. I promise. Before we do the questions, because you've led us to this idea that we all blithely assumed that our EPA had our back, and maybe we probably weren't paying attention well enough because there was asbestos still unregulated. Now I think people are a little more dialed into what's going on because it's gone to 11. It's above the radar. So I'm at the risk of sounding a little bit like I'm wearing rose-colored glasses or a Pollyanna. Is this the silver lining? To the extent that people are now a little more tuned in, what can we? I'm grasping for something here. Yes. And why don't you start, Jessie? We'll go down the line. If you have any degree of optimism that this is somehow sparking more widespread interest in these issues, and perhaps that's something that we who are involved in less cancer can help ride that wave.
Yes, I do think there is some reason to think that more people are getting involved. They're more interested in the topics that we've been talking about. And because of that, the education, the communication is out there. There's a higher level of mobilization, people actually getting involved in doing something about it, advocating, speaking out. And so I do think that is, and whether you're talking about big NGOs or you're talking about it at a very local level, and talking about some of the high schools and actually trying to do something, make a difference at where you live, at a community level.
Linda?
Well, embracing hopelessness is not an option when you're a widow and you work with others. So I think that we have a new, not to sound like Oprah, but I think we are on the new horizon, that we have to be responsible. We have some wins. And if you think your voice doesn't matter, I want to tell you you're wrong, because look at Michael Dorson. We as NGOs all got behind an industry-backed scientist who was going to be second in charge of the EPA, and he had to personally withdraw his nomination because he was not going to be confirmed. So we see that as a win and a cause to really combine forces. And there's coalitions of probably about 500 of us with NGOs that work together to reduce chemical exposures and shape public policy.
May.
Yeah, I'll try to be optimistic. But yeah, I think, what Jessie said was right. And, just at NRDC alone, we do action alerts and education, things like that. And we are finding a lot more of our members and people are more engaged than they were, say, even a year ago, because I think people are feeling like I got to do something. And I think that is, that's the feeling that people want to do something, and so we should take advantage of that and give them things to do.
Rob.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've been shocked, frankly, at how things have changed since early 2016, just in the realm of drinking water contamination. There's been a remarkable change in awareness and coverage by the media of the issues, particularly after Flint, Michigan. Just the people are paying a lot more attention to what is there when I turn that tap on, and are raising now a lot more questions about it, are asking for their legislators or their local representatives to take action when this stuff turns up in their water now. And I've been working on this now for 18, 19 years. Since 2016, there's been more change in that small period of time than all of that time together. Just in general awareness and recognition, this is something we're not gonna tolerate in our water anymore.
Well, good. So now we don't have to go slit our wrists. We appreciate that,
But
Rob.
Miles?
Yeah.
I really want to say two quick things.
Yeah.
One is less cancer has really shown up and muscled up, and that needs to be applauded because what you do matters. That's one.
Yeah.
I mean, Bill moves on a jet ski, not on the Titanic. If I call him up and say, hey, Bill, we got this issue, he's like, what can I do? We do it like you go through your board, the proper channels, but we're able to be responsive. And the other is the media. I urge you to look at who is writing what story. What's the byline? Who do they represent? Because if you don't have the media covering toxic chemical exposures and policy reversals, you can't really arm yourself with the information. So the media does matter.
And I just, on a personal note, 1 year ago, I literally killed every story I was working on and restacked the deck to focus on this. And I think there are a lot of people like me who've, just in the journalism world, who've decided this is an important thing to be weighing in on. So hopefully that will raise public awareness. No more question from Susie. Any other questions, Missy? Hang on one second. Let me come to you.
So we are seeing in the news all the time about glyphosate and the fact that France has decided to get rid of glyphosate, yet we seem to be turning a blind eye at this. I hear you say it as a pesticide. I thought of it as an herbicide, but is it both? So that's
An
a question.
herbicide is a type of pesticide.
Okay,
Pesticides,
so it's all in a whole thing. Mm-hmm. So is this energizing people, EPA, and people who are making the laws because it's becoming an international issue, or are we just sort of sitting on the bylines?
You want to speak?
Getting sicker and sicker.
I think it depends who you talk to and what sector you're talking to. A lot of NGOs are very involved in glyphosate and exposure. There's a lot of good science that actually shows the different effects of exposure, different levels, farm workers, and also residential use as well, because Roundup is one of the most widely used herbicides anywhere. And so I think it really depends on which sector you're looking at, but certainly industry is not happy about it in the U.S., and so there's a lot of pushback on that.
Yeah, I mean, Monsanto just is throwing lots of money at fighting the other side, fighting the science, buying off people to kind of, to support their side. There's no science showing that this is a problem and things like that. So, I mean, it's a very uphill battle because of the amount of money that is on the other side, but we're trying.
I think we might have time for one more question. If there's one out there, I'll come to you. Yes. Hang on one second. Hang on. Let me get the mic to you so people can hear.
Just a very practical question, since there are the chemicals on the fruits. I mean, obviously we don't want them on there, but they are. What can we tell families to do to help in getting them off if we're giving them to little kids or eating them ourselves? We tend to just rinse them off very quickly. Does that do anything, or what is the most effective thing to do to make them safer?
Yeah, unfortunately, you should wash anyway for other reasons. It doesn't necessarily get the pesticide off. So purchasing, if you can, organic and fruits and vegetables that don't use pesticides is important. And then there's the part about kind of like you were saying, voting with your dollars. And so there are a lot of and we've been thinking about like what are some kind of market-based things that we can do, but there are, companies that have kids meals, like give out carrots or whatever, like a McDonald's or whatever, asking them like, are the vegetables that you give to the kids, do you know like what pesticides are on those? Are you talking to your suppliers? Are you trying to make sure that they don't have these different pesticides on them? And like starting to create that kind of accountability for them can, try to help push that side of the market too.
Can I
Wait,
chime in
and-
too?
But
Just
yes.
real quick.
Go ahead.
All three of us. There's a great resource. It's The Dirty Dozen by EWG with photographs and names, and you can take a look. What are the top 12 fruits and vegetables that you might want to go organic, like May's saying? And if nothing else, you'll scrub a little harder and you'll dive a little deeper to get that clean product. But knowing what are the top 12, I think, is the first step.
And that way, I mean, because some of them are actually taken up systemically into the whatever you're eating, the fruit or the vegetable, and some of them you really can't wash clean. Like May said, lettuces, any leafy greens, grapes, or berries, they're very hard to actually get anything off of. And so some of them, and like Linda said, looking at the list of the ones that are kind of the big ones that you should try to avoid. That's and if you can be choosy about the ones that okay, well, I can't buy organic for everything. I'm going to buy organic for these.
We've done, as part of this chlorpyrifos story we're doing, I'll just give you a little preview. We've actually tested a fair amount of fruit, and there's a lot of chlorpyrifos out there on fruits. And so, and we have not found it in stuff that is labeled organic. So that adds to your expense, but the concerns you might have about ingesting chlorpyrifos, you have to weigh that, right?
Can I add to that just one sec? Can I ask a question or make a statement on that?
You're the boss, man.
No, I'm not the boss. I'm just the microphone jockey. But they have, people ask me all the time about shopping for foods. And I personally either try to know my farmer or because I live on the road virtually. I don't know my farmer on the road. In some cities I do know them. But I do reach for the green and white USDA organic label, and I want consumers to remember here that words like natural or grown in my backyard and all these fuzzy, warm things don't really translate too much. So when you're shopping, you will shop and vote with your dollars when you either know the farmer or you reach for that green and white USDA organic label. Organic is a brand of the USDA. It's not perfect. It's the best thing we've got out there today. So I just, for consumers, wanted to add that piece in. So when you're making these choices, how do you keep up with the 12 or the most or this chemical or that chemical? I don't have that kind of brain power. So I look for the green and white label, and if I can afford it, I buy it. And that is if I don't know my farmer. I live in a rural community, so I'm very fortunate to be able to know many farmers. I know that's not the case for everybody. Anyway, I'm sorry.
Well, I think unless there's another question, we're pretty much out of time. Oh, wait, one more over here? Yeah, hang on 1 second.
I live on the Old Mission Peninsula, and we have lots of cherries and apples and grapes, and there's tons of chemicals and lots of soft tissue cancers. I happen to ride with somebody who grows Honeycrisp apples, which everybody loves and is after. The hard part when you go to the grocery stores are that if there is a ding or a dent in that apple, it is disregarded as being worthless because people want perfect red apples. So there are chemicals that go out to keep all the bugs away, to de-stem these apples, as well as to make them red because people want red apples. So there's tons of chemicals. I'm out at this farm all the time, and it's kind of frightening. I would tell you the best thing to do is peel your apples if you don't know. The other thing is buy organic. I agree with that completely. And if there's a bruise or a dent, it's really not meaningful. It does not affect the quality of that apple. In fact, you may be better off with that. The other thing is if you eat animals, you are eating a concentrated amount of chemicals that are in the fat of those animals. So the less meat products or products of something that eats something, the better off you are because you get a concentration of chemicals in the fat.
A lot of chemicals are used just for that cosmetic component. If we changed our view of apples or bananas, that would, we have a couple more. Should we do more? All right. Over at the young side of the house here. I'm going to get my walker and try to make my way over to the youngsters. All right, go ahead.
So up until this point, access has really been a question about today. And I guess my challenge is that Organic is really expensive, and it's especially expensive for the populations at the highest risk. So I guess as if we're really about less cancer, I think we need to have strategies that are combating that in really creative ways, because in a lot of communities, and especially rural food deserts, it's really impossible to get healthy fruits and vegetables at all, much less organic labels.
Can I answer that? Because I think that is what we're all about. We are less cancer for everybody, and we understand access. One of the better examples that we first started reporting on 14 years ago was a USDA organic urban farm in Detroit that prepares 3,000 meals, I think 2,500 to 3,000 meals out of a USDA organic garden for homeless people. That is a fabulous model. It's not everywhere. We understand that's a real situation, but I love the fact that they are getting these foods to people that are healthy and keep them healthy, because you're exactly right. Those are the people that need the healthiest foods, and it matters to get them the food that will keep them healthy. So we're right on board with that. We are mindful of that, and it is part of our conversation. So thanks for that feedback.
But not an easy one to solve. For
No,
sure. Go ahead.
no.
There you go.
Hello. I was wondering if you guys could touch on the idea of removing antimicrobials from soap. It was one of the topics listed on the...
Oh. Yeah, that is mine. Well,
You've hit her sweet spot for sure. Go ahead, May.
Thanks for asking. I did. Thanks. I hope I paid you enough. Well, so the two main chemicals that were found in a lot of hand soaps, antibacterial hand soaps, were triclosan and triclocarban. And that was actually one of the examples of Miles's question: is how did we decide to work on it? And it was one of those things where the science is very clear about the impacts of triclosan and triclocarban on human health. And then on the flip side, the science was also really clear that there was no extra benefit to washing your hands with soap that contained triclosan than washing your soap with washing your hands with regular soap and water. And so for us, it was a no-brainer that we should go after this kind of ridiculous use of a toxic chemical. Given as, easy as that science is to understand, it took 8 years and very many different tactics to finally get to the point where I think we sued FDA, and then they appealed, and then years and years later, but we finally were able to get FDA to put out a regulation that said that triclosan, triclocarban, and a few other chemicals that are similarly unhelpful and dangerous could not be used in antibacterial soaps. They just did one on healthcare hand washes too, so those used in healthcare settings. And so that one also had triclosan, and those chemicals wouldn't be able to be used. And so then there's a third stage of it, which is the hand sanitizers. And so because of our lawsuit, there's a deadline for FDA to make a decision on that. I think it's like 2019. But I'm happy to tell you whatever you want to know about it. But that's the gist of it.
That's just the tip of the iceberg on that one for sure. I think that's probably it on time, right? Hey, please give our panelists a warm round of applause. Thank you very much.